Hello, wonderful listeners, and welcome to our channel. Settle in, get comfortable, and prepare to embark on an epic journey back in time to one of history's most pivotal moments. If you enjoy delving into the past with us, please hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Now, let the story begin. Before the year 1492 etched itself irrevocably into the annals of global history, before the names of continents shifted in the European consciousness, and before the course of human civilization veered sharply onto a new, irreversible trajectory, there was a man, not a king, nor a celebrated scholar, but a mariner of humble origins, whose mind, however, harbored a vision so audacious, so contrary to the prevailing wisdom, that for years it was dismissed as the fanciful delusion of a madman. His name was Cristobal Colon, known to the English-speaking world as Christopher Columbus. Born in Genoa, a bustling maritime republic on the Ligurian coast, likely in 1451, Columbus entered a world shaped by the relentless rhythm of the sea. His father, Domenico Colombo, was a wool weaver, a trade that offered stability but little prospect for the grand adventures that beckoned his eldest son. From a young age, the allure of the ocean proved irresistible. Genoa, with its vibrant port teeming with ships from across the known world, was a crucible of maritime knowledge and ambition. The scent of salt, tar, and exotic spices hung heavy in the air, fueling the imaginations of boys like Christopher, who dreamed not of weaving wool, but of navigating the boundless blue. Columbus's early life remains somewhat shrouded in the mists of history, a testament to his later self-fashioning and the retrospective grandeur cast upon him by his monumental achievements. What is certain is that he did not follow his father into the weaving trade for long. Instead, he took to the sea, as a young man joining various commercial voyages across the Mediterranean. These were not pleasure cruises, but dangerous, arduous expeditions, fraught with the perils of storms, pirates, and uncharted shoals. He learned the practicalities of seamanship, how to read the winds and currents, how to manage a crew, how to navigate by the stars, and how to survive the capricious moods of the open ocean. These early voyages took him to the Aegean Sea, to the shores of North Africa, and perhaps even as far north as Iceland if some accounts are to be believed. While the latter remains debated, it speaks to the breadth of his early travels and his thirst for experience. He absorbed knowledge like a sponge, not from dusty academic tomes, but from the hard-won lessons of the sea, from the grizzled captains and seasoned sailors with whom he shared cramped quarters and meager rations. He became intimately familiar with the trade routes, the prevailing winds, and the subtle shifts in the ocean's character. By the mid-1470s, Columbus found himself in Portugal, a nation at the vanguard of European exploration. Lisbon, its capital, was then the undisputed center of maritime innovation, fueled by the visionary patronage of Prince Henry the Navigator. Though Henry had died before Columbus's arrival, his legacy endured. Portuguese caravels, sleek and nimble, were pushing ever further down the African coast, charting new territories and establishing lucrative trade networks in gold, ivory, and slaves. This was a world buzzing with geographical discovery, where the boundaries of the known world were being redrawn with every successful voyage. It was in this vibrant intellectual and maritime environment that Columbus's nascent ideas began to coalesce. He settled in Lisbon, married Filipa Peristello y Muñez, the daughter of a Portuguese navigator, and began to devour maps, charts, and travelogues. He studied the works of ancient geographers like Ptolemy, whose geocentric model of the universe, though flawed, provided a framework for understanding the Earth. More importantly, he absorbed the accounts of Marco Polo and Sir John Mandeville, whose tales of the opulent East, Cathay, China, and Cipango, Japan, fired his imagination with visions of immense wealth and exotic wonders. His time in Portugal was crucial. He engaged in cartography, drawing maps that incorporated the latest discoveries and his own growing understanding of the Earth's dimensions. He sailed on Portuguese expeditions to the Gold Coast of Africa and perhaps even to the Azores, gaining further experience in long-distance ocean travel. It was during these years that his grand theory began to take shape. If the Earth was indeed a sphere, then one could reach the east not by sailing around Africa, a long and arduous journey perfected by the Portuguese, but by sailing directly west across the Atlantic. The prevailing European geographical knowledge, heavily influenced by Ptolemy, underestimated the true circumference of the Earth and vastly overestimated the eastward extent of Asia. Columbus, perhaps by design or by miscalculation, leaned into these inaccuracies. He believed the distance across the Atlantic to be far shorter than it actually was, placing Sapongo, Japan, much closer to Europe than it truly lay. This fundamental miscalculation, combined with his fervent belief in his own destiny, would become both the catalyst for his extraordinary voyage and, in a strange twist of fate, the source of his greatest triumph. For without this error, no European ruler would have dared to finance such a seemingly impossible undertaking. The stage was set, not for a precise scientific expedition, but for an act of audacious faith. Columbus, a man driven by ambition, piety, and a touch of stubborn delusion, was about to challenge the very edges of the known world.
Columbus's theory, audacious as it was not entirely without precedent. The idea of a spherical Earth had been accepted by scholars for centuries, and ancient Greek geographers had even made remarkably accurate estimates of its circumference. However, the practical implications of sailing west to reach the east were fraught with immense challenges and uncertainties. The vastness of the ocean sea, as the Atlantic was then known, was largely unknown and terrifying. Legends of sea monsters, colossal whirlpools, and the very edge of the world where ships might tumble into an abyss populated the popular imagination. While educated men dismissed such superstitions, the sheer logistical and navigational difficulties remained daunting. Columbus, however, was undeterred. His conviction grew with each passing year, fueled by his studies, his practical experience at sea, and perhaps by a profound sense of divine destiny. He believed God had chosen him for this monumental task. Armed with his calculations, his maps, and an unshakable belief in his westward route, he began the arduous process of seeking patronage. A voyage of this magnitude required immense financial resources, far beyond the means of any private individual. It needed the backing of a powerful monarch, someone willing to risk vast sums on an enterprise that many considered foolhardy. His first approach, naturally, was to the Kingdom of Portugal. Portugal, under King John II, was at the forefront of maritime exploration, actively pursuing a sea route to the east by rounding the southern tip of Africa. Bartolomeu Diaz had already pushed deep into the South Atlantic, and Vasco da Gama was soon to complete the circuit, reaching India by sea. Columbus presented his proposal to King John II around 1884. He argued that his westward route was faster, safer, and would give Portugal a decisive advantage in the race for the lucrative spice trade. The Portuguese court, however, was not easily swayed. King John II, a shrewd and pragmatic ruler, referred Columbus's proposal to a royal commission of maritime experts and cosmographers. These learned men, well-versed in the latest geographical knowledge and experienced in long-distance navigation, subjected Columbus's calculations to rigorous scrutiny. They were particularly concerned with his estimate of the Earth's circumference and the presumed short distance to Asia. Unlike Columbus, they had more accurate estimations of the globe's size and correctly deduced that Asia was far more distant than he claimed. Moreover, Portugal was already heavily invested in its African route. They had spent decades and vast resources meticulously charting the African coastline, establishing trading posts, and developing the necessary navigational techniques. To abandon this proven, albeit slow path for a speculative and seemingly impossible westward journey seemed illogical and financially reckless. After careful deliberation, the Portuguese commission rejected Columbus's proposal. The official verdict was that his estimates were wildly inaccurate and that the proposed voyage was impractical. It was a crushing blow, but one that only hardened Columbus's resolve. He left Portugal in late 1485 or early 1486, a man without a patron, his dreams seemingly dashed. He brought with him his young son Diego, his wife having passed away. His destination, the neighboring kingdom of Castile, the most powerful of the Spanish kingdoms. Spain, recently unified by the marriage of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, was a rising power, but it lagged behind Portugal in maritime exploration. Its energies were primarily focused on the Reconquista, the centuries-long struggle to expel the Muslim Moors from the Iberian Peninsula. Granada, the last Moorish stronghold, remained unconquered, and the war consumed most of Spain's resources in detention. Despite this, Columbus saw an opportunity. Perhaps a new, ambitious monarchy, eager to rival Portugal's successes, would be more receptive to his radical ideas. He arrived in Spain, a foreigner with a grand, improbable scheme, and little to commend him beyond his own fervent conviction. He found initial refuge at the Franciscan monastery of La Rábida, near the port of Pylos. Here he encountered sympathetic ears in the form of Friar Juan Perez, a former confessor to Queen Isabella, and Martín Alonso Pinzón, a wealthy and influential mariner from Pylos. These men, recognizing the potential, however remote, of Columbus's vision, provided him with crucial introductions to the Spanish court. Thus began a period of frustrating delays, endless petitions, and repeated rejections. For nearly 7 years, Columbus followed the Spanish court from city to city, a persistent shadow pressing his case. He presented his proposal to Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, detailing the immense wealth to be gained from direct access to the spice lands of the East, the opportunity to spread Christianity, and the glory that would accrue to Spain. The Spanish monarchs, though intrigued, were cautious. They too referred Columbus's plan to a council of experts, primarily scholars from the University of Salamanca. Like their Portuguese counterparts, these learned men found Columbus's calculations flawed. They argued that the Earth was far larger than he claimed, and that even if he could sail west, the distance to Asia would be impossibly vast, requiring a voyage of such duration that no ship or crew could possibly survive. Furthermore, the war with Granada was draining the royal coffers. There was little appetite for such a speculative and expensive venture. Columbus, however, refused to give up. His tenacity was extraordinary. He lived in relative poverty, often relying on the kindness of others, but his belief in his mission never wavered. He refined his arguments, emphasized the potential for Christian evangelization, and perhaps most importantly, waited for the political winds to shift in his favor. His patience, a virtue honed by years at sea, would ultimately prove to be his greatest asset in the labyrinthine corridors of royal power. The years between 1486 and 1492 were a test of Christopher Columbus's unwavering resolve. He endured rejection after rejection, his appeals falling on deaf ears, or at best receiving polite but firm dismissals. The academic councils, composed of the most learned minds in Spain, consistently found his geographical calculations to be erroneous. They were not entirely wrong. Columbus's estimate of the Earth's circumference was indeed significantly smaller than reality, and his belief that Asia lay just a few thousand miles west of Europe was a profound miscalculation. Yet it was this very miscalculation, born of an ardent desire to believe, that made his audacious plan seem remotely feasible. Had he known the true distance, it's unlikely he would have ever embarked or found a patron. The Spanish court was a whirlwind of political intrigue, religious fervor, and military campaigns. Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, known as the Catholic monarchs, were consumed by the final stages of the Reconquista. Their focus was singularly on Granada, the last Moorish stronghold in Spain. Every motivati, every soldier, every strategic thought was directed towards this monumental endeavor. Columbus, with his fantastical tales of Cipango and Cathay, must have seemed a mere distraction, an irritating fly buzzing around the royal tent. Yet, he persisted. He cultivated alliances where he could, gaining the support of influential figures like Luis de Santangel, the keeper of the privy purse, and Juan Cabrero, the royal chamberlain. These men, perhaps more pragmatic than the scholars, saw the potential, however slim, for immense gain. They understood the geopolitical rivalry with Portugal and recognized that if Columbus's claims held any truth, Spain could leapfrog its rival in the race for eastern riches. Moreover, Columbus appealed to Isabella's deep religious piety. He framed his enterprise not just as a commercial venture, but as a divine mission to spread Christianity to unreached lands, to gather wealth that could fund a new crusade to reclaim Jerusalem, and to fulfill biblical prophecies. This religious zeal resonated deeply with the Queen, who saw herself as a champion of the Catholic faith. The turning point arrived in January 1492. After nearly 8 centuries, the city of Granada fell. The long and bloody Reconquista was finally over. The Catholic monarchs rode triumphantly into the Alhambra, their power consolidated, their kingdom unified. With the war concluded, their attention could finally turn to other matters, including the tantalizing, though still uncertain, prospects offered by this persistent Genoese mariner. Even then, the negotiations were tense and nearly collapsed. Columbus, despite his humble origins and years of supplicancy, made extraordinary demands. He insisted on being appointed Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy, and Governor of any new lands he discovered. And, most controversially, he demanded a tenth of all riches, gold, silver, pearls, spices, and other merchandise found or acquired in the new territories. These were terms more fitting for a conquering prince than a hopeful explorer. The court's advisors were aghast. Such demands were unprecedented. They urged the monarchs to reject him outright. Columbus, proud and unyielding, refused to compromise. He packed his bags, ready to leave Spain and offer his services to another kingdom, perhaps France or even England. It was at this critical juncture that Santangel and Cabrero intervened once more. They pleaded with Isabella, highlighting the potential shame and loss if Columbus succeeded under another flag. They reminded her of the relatively small investment required compared to the immense potential rewards. They argued that if he failed, the loss would be minimal. If he succeeded, the glory and wealth would be immeasurable. Isabella, perhaps swayed by their arguments, or by a sudden surge of intuition, or even by a sense of divine prompting, made a momentous decision. She declared that she would undertake the venture for her own kingdom of Castile, and even, if necessary, pawn her own jewels to finance it. A dramatic gesture that, while perhaps apocryphal in its literal sense, certainly captured the spirit of her commitment. The Capitulaciones de Santa Fe, signed in April 1492, formalized the agreement. Columbus was granted his titles, Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy and Governor of the islands and mainlands he might discover. He was to receive 1/10 of all net profits from the venture, and he would have the right to invest 1/8 of the cost of any future expedition in exchange for 1/8 of the profits. These were incredibly generous terms, reflecting both Columbus's tenacity and the monarch's desperate hope for a breakthrough. The financial backing for the voyage came from various sources. The Crown provided some funds, but a significant portion came from loans, primarily from Luis de Santangel, who advanced the money from the Santa Hermandad, a Castilian law enforcement organization. Martin Alonso Pinzon, the wealthy ship owner from Palos, who had supported Columbus earlier, also contributed a substantial sum and committed to providing 2 ships and their crews. The stage was now set. After years of pleading, rejection, and unwavering faith, Christopher Columbus finally had his chance. The objective was clear: sail west across the Atlantic to reach the rich markets of Asia, bypassing the Portuguese route around Africa. The rewards promised were immense: gold, spices, new converts to Christianity, and unparalleled glory for the Spanish crown. The risks were equally vast: the unknown terrors of the ocean sea, the possibility of miscalculation, mutiny, or simply vanishing without a trace into the watery expanse. But for Columbus, the dream was finally within reach.
With the capitulation signed, the next monumental task was the preparation of the fleet. The chosen port was Palos de la Frontera, a small but active maritime town in Andalusia known for its experienced sailors and its strategic location near the mouth of the Tinto River. Palos was also under royal decree to provide 2 caravels to the crown as a penalty for past infringements, making it an ideal choice for the expedition's outfitting. Columbus himself arrived in Palos in May 1492, armed with the royal mandate. His mission was to procure and outfit 3 ships and, more challenging still, to recruit a crew willing to embark on a voyage into the unknown. The task was not easy. Despite the royal decree and the promise of adventure, there was widespread apprehension about the proposed westward journey. The Atlantic was considered a vast, perilous expanse, and many sailors feared they would simply sail off the edge of the world or be swallowed by mythical beasts. Local mariners were reluctant to sign on, their skepticism fueled by the prevailing geographical wisdom and the chilling tales of the ocean sea. Columbus faced significant resistance and even outright hostility. It was here that the crucial support of the Pinzon brothers, Martín Alonso Vincennes and Francisco Martín Pinzon, proved indispensable. The Pinzon family were prominent and highly respected mariners and ship owners in Palos. Their reputation, wealth, and influence were instrumental in overcoming the local reluctance. Martín Alonso Pinzon, the eldest and most experienced of the brothers, was a shrewd and ambitious sailor. He not only committed to providing 2 of his own vessels, the Pinta and the Niña, but he also actively used his considerable influence to recruit crew members. He persuaded skeptical sailors, promising higher wages and the prospect of adventure and riches. His brother, Vincennes Pinzon, would captain the Niña, and Francisco Martín Pinzon, another brother, would serve as master of the Pinta. Their involvement lent the expedition much-needed credibility and helped to fill the ranks. The 3 ships chosen for the voyage were small by modern standards, but well suited for exploration. The flagship was the Santa Maria, a larger nau, or carrack, of around 100 tons, though its exact size is debated. It was a slower, heavier ship, designed for cargo and commanded by Columbus. The other 2 were caravels, the Pinta and the Niña. Caravels were swift, highly maneuverable vessels with latent sails that allowed them to sail closer to the wind, making them ideal for exploration and navigating unknown waters. The Pinta was slightly larger than the Niña, and both were probably around 50 to 60 tons. They were relatively small vessels to cross an entire ocean, a testament to the daring nature of the enterprise. The process of outfitting the ships was a flurry of activity. Carpenters, caulkers, and sailmakers worked feverishly. Provisions were loaded: hardtack biscuits, salted meat and fish, wine, water, oil, beans, and cheese. These staples, while monotonous, were designed to be long-lasting. There were also supplies for trade: glass beads, bells, mirrors, and other trinkets intended as gifts or bartering items for the native populations they expected to encounter in Asia. Navigational instruments, quadrants, astrolabes, compasses, and hourglasses were carefully stowed. Maps and charts, some drawn by Columbus himself, were kept under lock and key. The crew assembled for the voyage numbered around 90 men, though precise figures vary, spread across the 3 ships. They were a diverse lot: seasoned sailors, young cabin boys,
officers, a surgeon, a secretary, a royal comptroller, and even a few adventurers. All of them were from Andalusia, particularly the region around Palos and Huelva, accustomed to the sea and the risks it entailed. Their motivations were varied. Some sought riches and glory, others adventure, some perhaps fleeing debts or legal troubles. All of them, however, were stepping into the vast unknown. On August 2nd, 1492, everything was ready. The ships were fully provisioned, the sails mended, the rigging checked, and the crews aboard. The atmosphere in Palos must have been a mixture of excitement, anxiety, and solemnity. Many of the sailors knew this might be their last sight of home. Families gathered on the shore, offering tearful goodbyes and whispered prayers. The following morning, on Friday, August 3rd, 1492, under the blessing of the dawn light, the three ships, the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Nina, weighed anchor and began their epic-making journey. They slipped down the Tinto River, past the monastery of La Rabida, where Columbus had found solace and support in his darkest hours. As they reached the open sea, their sails caught the morning breeze, and they turned southwest, heading toward the Canary Islands, the last known outpost of European civilization before the vast, uncharted expanse of the Atlantic. The departure was not without its immediate challenges. Shortly after setting sail, the Pinta, known for being a fast ship, developed a problem with its rudder, likely deliberately sabotaged by its owner, who was reluctant to participate in the voyage. Columbus ordered the fleet to put in at the Canary Islands for repairs. This brief stopover, lasting about a month, also allowed for final provisioning and adjustments. The Nina, originally latent-rigged, was re-rigged with square sails, making it more suitable for ocean crossing and following winds. By September 6, 1492, all repairs and preparations were complete. From the island of La Gomera, the ships set their course due west, leaving behind the familiar shores of Europe, venturing into the vast, mysterious ocean sea towards a destiny none could yet comprehend.
As the final fate outlines of the Canary Islands faded into the eastern horizon, the three small ships found themselves truly alone, adrift in the immense, unbroken expanse of the Atlantic. The ocean sea, as it was known, stretched before them, a vast, unknowable entity that for centuries had served as the ultimate barrier to westward travel. For the sailors, many of whom had never ventured beyond sight of land for such an extended period, the sheer emptiness of the horizon must have been both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The initial days of the voyage were characterized by the rhythm of the trade winds, which, as Columbus had correctly anticipated, provided a steady push westward. The ships, though small, were robust, designed to withstand the rigors of the open ocean. Life aboard was cramped and monotonous. The crew, numbering around 30 men on each of the caravels and more on the Santa Maria, lived in close quarters, sharing meager rations and enduring the constant pitching and rolling of the vessels. Hardtack biscuits, salted meat and fish, dry beans and wine formed the staple diet, supplemented by whatever fresh fish they could catch. Water, stored in wooden barrels, quickly grew stale. Hygiene was rudimentary, and the constant dampness and lack of space bred discomfort and disease. Yet, these men were hardened mariners, accustomed to the privations of sea life. Their focus was on the daily routine, maintaining the sails, checking the rigging, bailing out water, and standing watch. Navigation was a complex art, relying on a combination of dead reckoning and celestial observation. Columbus, a master of this craft, used a compass to maintain a consistent westerly course. At night, he relied on the North Star, though its position changed slightly as they moved south. During the day, he estimated their speed and direction, calculating their progress. One of Columbus's shrewd strategies was to keep two sets of logs, one for himself, recording the true, greater distance covered, and another, deliberately underestimated, for his crew. He understood that the psychological impact of seeing the vast distances they were covering with no land in sight could erode morale and foster despair. By underreporting the daily mileage, he kept their hopes alive, making the journey seem shorter than it was. Weeks turned into a month. The sun rose and set, painting spectacular hues across the endless ocean, but the horizon remained stubbornly empty.
The initial excitement and novelty of the voyage slowly gave way to apprehension. The crew, accustomed to coastal sailing, grew increasingly anxious with each passing day that brought no sight of land. Doubts began to fester. Had Columbus miscalculated? Were they sailing into an endless void? Whispers spread through the ships. Some men feared they would never find a return wind, that the prevailing easterlies would be impossible to sail against. The compass, too, seemed to betray them. As they sailed westward, the compass needle, which normally points true north, began to deviate slightly from the North Star. This phenomenon, magnetic declination, was unknown to European navigators at the time. To the superstitious sailors, it was a terrifying omen, suggesting that even the very instruments of navigation were failing them, perhaps signaling that they were entering a realm beyond God's design. Columbus, however, understood this anomaly, or at least was able to explain it away with a calm demeanor, reassuring his men that it was a natural variation and not a sign of impending doom. His leadership was constantly tested. He was a complex figure, deeply religious, fiercely ambitious, and incredibly stubborn. He possessed an unwavering belief in his mission, a conviction that bordered on fanaticism. This conviction was infectious at times, but also infuriating to his men who longed for the sight of solid ground. Signs of land, however fleeting, became sources of intense excitement and crushing disappointment. On September 13, they saw a large piece of a mast, suggesting human activity, but it was merely flotsam. On September 17, they spotted a large tuft of green weed, a freshwater crab, and various land birds. These were encouraging signs, indicating proximity to land. Yet days passed without a glimpse of shore. The hope these sightings inspired would quickly turn to exasperation when the horizon remained empty. By the end of September, the crew's patience was wearing thin. They had been at sea for over 3 weeks since leaving the Canaries, far longer than any previous westward voyage attempt. The monotony, the stale food and water, the constant anxiety, and the lack of visible progress began to take their toll. Open grumbling escalated to outright complaints. Mutiny, a constant fear on long voyages, began to loom as a tangible threat. Stories from the voyage describe Columbus's struggles to maintain discipline and morale. He employed a mix of persuasion, promises of riches, and stern warnings. He reminded them of the wealth awaiting them, of the glory they would achieve for Spain and for God. He threatened to hang any men who dared to challenge his authority. Accounts vary on the severity of the discontent, but it is clear that by early October, many of the sailors were on the verge of open rebellion. They pleaded with him to turn back, to avoid certain death in the boundless ocean. Columbus, however, held firm. He knew that to turn back now would be to admit defeat, to relinquish his life's dream. He promised them that land was near, that the signs were unmistakable. He implored them to trust him, to hold on for just a few more days. His resolve, forged over years of struggle and rejection, was absolute. He understood that the success or failure of the entire enterprise rested on his ability to keep his men moving westward just a little bit longer. The fate of the expedition, and indeed the course of history, hung precariously on the razor edge of his unwavering will against the mounting despair of his crew. The first week of October 1492 was a crucible for the expedition. The crew's morale had plummeted to its lowest ebb. The initial signs of land, the birds, the floating debris, which had once inspired hope, now seemed like cruel illusions. Days blurred into weeks, and the endless expanse of the ocean mocked their dwindling provisions and their fraying nerves. The sun, once a source of warmth, now beat down relentlessly, reflecting off the shimmering water, creating a mirage of despair. The grumbling escalated into open defiance. Sailors of all 3 ships began to question Columbus's judgment, his sanity, and even his honesty. They spoke of turning the ships around, of forcing the admiral to abandon his foolhardy quest. The threat of mutiny, which had been a whisper, became a palpable, dangerous presence on the ships. Columbus, however, met their despair with an unyielding resolve. He was a man possessed by a singular vision, and he would not be swayed. According to some accounts, he made a pact with his officers, promising to turn back if land was not sighted within 3 days. While the veracity of this specific agreement is debated, it speaks to the extreme pressure he was under. What is clear is that he employed every tactic at his disposal: persuasion, promises of riches, appeals to their faith, and veiled threats of severe punishment for insubordination. He reminded them of the royal decree, of the glory awaiting them, and of the shame of returning empty-handed. His personal log, a testament to his mental fortitude, recorded the signs of land with an almost desperate optimism. On October 7th, the Niña, ever the fastest and most nimble of the caravels, spotted flocks of birds flying overhead, heading southwest. This was a significant sign. Unlike seabirds that might wander far from land, these were land-based birds, known to return to shore at night. Columbus, despite his previous commitment to a westward course, decided to alter their heading to follow the birds, reasoning that such a large flock must be flying towards a significant landmass. This decision, a testament to his flexibility and his keen observation, proved to be one of the most crucial of the entire voyage. The new course, however, did not immediately yield results, and the tension mounted. The crew continued their protests, their voices hoarse with exhaustion and fear. Columbus's authority hung by a thread. He pushed them, driving them onward, day and night, ignoring their pleas to turn back. He was a man driven by a profound sense of destiny, a belief that he was divinely appointed to achieve this grand endeavor. To him, failure was not an option. Then, on October 11th, the signs became undeniable. The air itself seemed to change, carrying the scent of land, a subtle, earthy fragrance distinct from the salty tang of the open ocean. Floating in the water were unmistakable indicators: a green branch with fresh berries, a small carved stick, and even a live crab. These were not random pieces of flotsam. They were clear evidence of nearby land. The excitement surged through the ships. The mood swung from despair to fervent hope. Every sailor strained their eyes into the darkness, eager to be the first to spot the elusive shore. Columbus, for his part, offered a special reward of 10,000 maravedis, a substantial sum, to the first person to cry, "Land! Land ahead!" The cry, though often attributed to Rodrigo de Triana aboard the Pinta, was in fact made by Columbus himself, hours before the official sighting. Around 10 p.m. on October 11, from the stern castle of the Santa Maria, Columbus perceived a faint, flickering light in the distance. It was a tiny, uncertain glimmer, like a small wax candle rising and falling. On the morning of October 12th, the 3 ships, the Pinta, the Niña, and Santa Maria, approached an island, the sight of land instantly soaking in the exhausted crew with a sense of awe and relief. Tierra! Tierra! Came at approximately 2 a.m. on October 12th, 1492, from the Pinta. This time, there was no doubt. Under the pale light of the moon, a dark mass loomed on the horizon. The tension that had gripped the fleet for weeks instantly evaporated, replaced by an overwhelming surge of elation and relief. Shouts of joy erupted from all 3 ships. Tears streamed down the faces of hardened sailors. They had done it. They had crossed the vast ocean sea, and land, solid, welcoming land, lay before them. The ships immediately lowered their sails, heaving to and waiting for the dawn. The remaining hours of darkness must have felt interminable, filled with anticipation and wonder. As the first rays of the rising sun pierced the eastern sky, they illuminated a sight that no European had ever witnessed. A small, flat island, verdant and fringed with white sandy beaches, surrounded by waters of an astonishing clarity and turquoise hue. Coconut palms swayed gently in the morning breeze, and the air was rich with the unfamiliar sense of tropical vegetation. Columbus, his heart pounding with triumph and a profound sense of destiny fulfilled, ordered the boats lowered. He dressed in his finest clothes, a scarlet cloak over his armor, and carried the royal standard of Castile. Martin Alonso Pinzon and Vicente Yañez Pinzon, captains of the Pinta and Niña, respectively, accompanied him in their own boats, bearing the banner of the expedition, a green cross with the letters F and Y for Ferdinand and Isabel, crowned on either side. With solemn ceremony, they rowed towards the shore. The keel of Columbus's boat scraped the soft sand, and he stepped onto solid ground. This moment, arguably one of the most significant in human history, was laden with profound meaning. For Europe, it represented the culmination of centuries of exploration, the opening of a new chapter of global expansion. For the indigenous peoples of the Americas, it marked the beginning of an encounter that would irrevocably alter their world forever. As Columbus stepped foot on the island, he knelt, kissed the ground, and wept with gratitude. Rising, he formally claimed the island for the Spanish monarchs, bestowing upon it the name San Salvador in honor of Christ the Savior, in fulfillment of his religious zeal. He was followed by his officers and crew, many of whom also knelt, overcome with emotion, some kissing his hands, others begging forgiveness for their earlier doubts and insubordination. It was then that they saw them. From the tree line, curious, gentle figures emerged. These were the native inhabitants of the island, the Taíno people, a branch of the Arawak. They were naked or nearly so, their skin a coppery hue, their hair coarse and black, often styled with feathers or painted with intricate designs. They approached cautiously, their expressions a mixture of fear, wonder, and curiosity. They had never seen people like these, nor ships like these, which they must have initially perceived as enormous, strange creatures from another world. Columbus, observing them, noted their physical beauty and their apparent lack of weapons. He described them as very well built, with very handsome bodies and very good faces. He quickly noted their simplicity and generosity. They showed no fear of the Spaniards, approaching them with open curiosity, touching their beards, and examining their unfamiliar clothing and weapons. The first exchange was a moment of profound cultural collision. Columbus, believing he had reached the Indies, naturally referred to the inhabitants as Indians. As Columbus continued his meticulous exploration of the Lucayan archipelago, his initial wonder slowly began to give way to a more pragmatic and at times frustrated assessment. Each island, while beautiful and seemingly abundant, failed to yield the vast quantities of gold or the sophisticated trading posts he so desperately sought. The Taino, though friendly and generous, consistently pointed to other, larger islands further south as the source of the elusive metal. This constant redirection, a game of geographical hot potato, fueled his determination while subtly shifting his perceptions. He observed the Taínos' way of life with a mixture of admiration and condescension. Their communal living, their simple tools, and their lack of a written language struck him as primitive. Yet he also noted their ingenuity, their finely crafted canoes, some large enough to hold dozens of people, and their effective methods of fishing and cultivating crops like cassava, maize, and sweet potatoes. He described their hammocks, a novel invention to European eyes, and their intricate body painting. Despite these observations, his primary focus remained unyielding, finding a direct route to the opulent markets of Asia and securing the immense wealth that would validate his voyage and fulfill his promises to the Spanish monarchs. The small gold ornaments worn by the Taino were tantalizing, but they were not the gold mines or vast trading networks he envisioned. He spent several weeks navigating through the Bahama chain, visiting a series of islands. He marveled at the clarity of the water, so transparent that he could see the bottom even at significant depths. He noted the abundance of exotic fish and the vibrant coral reefs. Yet the deeper he ventured, the more the reality of these islands diverged from his preconceived notions of the East. There were no grand cities, no silks, no spices in commercial quantities, and no signs of the powerful empires described by Marco Polo. The absence of these expected Asian characteristics did not, however, lead Columbus to question his fundamental geographical premise. Instead, he simply adjusted his interpretation. He reasoned that these were merely outlying islands, perhaps part of the vast archipelago that Marco Polo had described as lying off the coast of Cathay. The true mainland, he believed, must lie further south or west, where the gold and spices would surely be found. On October 28, 1492, after sailing south from the Bahamas, the fleet sighted a much larger landmass, its coastline stretching as far as the eye could see. This was the island the Taino called Golba, which Columbus, in his desire to connect it to the Asian mainland, promptly renamed Juana in honor of Prince Juan, the heir apparent of Castile. Today we know it as Cuba. Cuba was a revelation. Its lush, mountainous interior, dense forest, and numerous rivers presented a stark contrast to the flatter, smaller islands of the Bahamas. The sheer size of the island convinced Columbus that he had finally reached a part of the Asian mainland, or at least a very large island directly adjacent to it. He believed he was nearing the court of the Grand Khan. The exploration of Cuba lasted for several weeks. Columbus sailed along its northern coast, sending parties ashore to explore the interior. He sought signs of cities, of advanced civilizations, of anything that would confirm his belief that he was in Asia. The Spanish encountered more Taino villages, larger and more established than those in the Bahamas. They continued to observe the natives' customs, their agriculture, and their simple, peaceful way of life. It was during the exploration of Cuba that the Spanish first encountered tobacco, a plant smoked by the Taino in a primitive form of cigar. Columbus's men observed the natives inhaling the smoke, and some of the sailors even experimented with it, an early instance of cultural exchange with far-reaching consequences. They also noted the presence of dogs that did not bark, a curious detail. Despite the extensive exploration, the evidence of a powerful Asian empire remained stubbornly absent. No great ports, No gold mines, no spice plantations on a commercial scale. Columbus's reports back to Spain would later emphasize the beauty and fertility of the land, its potential for agriculture, and the docility of its inhabitants. But the core objective, establishing a lucrative trade route to the east, remained unfulfilled. Frustration began to mount, particularly among Martín Alonso Pinzón, the captain of the Pinta. Pinzón, a seasoned mariner and a pragmatic man, was growing impatient with the endless search for the elusive Grand Khan and the seemingly fruitless quest for gold. He believed that the real riches lay not in distant mythical empires, but in the immediate exploitation of the gold he believed existed on some of these islands. On November 21st, Pinzón, perhaps driven by his own ambition or a desire to strike out for gold independently, unilaterally separated the Pinta from the fleet without Columbus's permission. This act of insubordination was a serious breach of naval discipline and left Columbus with only 2 ships, the Santa Maria and the Niña. Pinzón, it was later revealed, was pursuing rumors of an island called Babec, where the natives supposedly collected gold on the beach by torchlight. This defection left Columbus deeply angered and concerned, not only for the safety of the Pinta, but also for the integrity of his command. He recorded his displeasure in his journal, accusing Pinzón of being greedy and disloyal. With the Pinta gone, Columbus, aboard the Santa Maria, and Vicente Juárez Pinzón on the Niña, continued their exploration. Despite the setback, Columbus remained convinced that the true wealth lay further east. The Taíno guides he had brought from the Bahamas continued to point towards a large island they called Haiti, or Buillo, located to the southeast of Cuba. They described it as a place rich in gold, a land where the rivers flowed over golden sands. This was precisely the kind of information Columbus longed to hear. On December 6, 1492, the 2 remaining ships sighted the eastern tip of this large island. Its majestic mountains, lush valleys, and numerous rivers immediately impressed Columbus. He named it La Isla Española, meaning the Spanish island, which would later become known as Hispaniola. This island, now shared by Haiti and the Dominican Republic, was destined to become the epicenter of early Spanish colonization in the Americas and the site of immense wealth extraction, but also profound tragedy. Hispaniola was indeed a land of remarkable beauty and natural resources. Its diverse landscape ranged from towering mountains to fertile plains crisscrossed by numerous rivers. The Taíno population on Hispaniola was also significantly larger in the Bahamas or even Cuba, with several powerful caciques, chiefs, ruling over different regions. Columbus spent weeks exploring the northern coast of Hispaniola, meticulously charting its bays and harbors. He was constantly on the lookout for signs of gold. The initial encounters with the Taíno of Hispaniola were, like those before, generally peaceful. The local caciques, particularly Guacanagari, who ruled over the region where Columbus would later establish a settlement, were welcoming and curious. They exchanged gifts, European trinkets for Taíno gold ornaments, cotton, and food. Columbus continued to be impressed by the generosity and perceived innocence of the natives. He noted their beautiful villages, their well-cultivated fields, and their peaceful demeanor. The presence of more visible gold, albeit still in small quantities, greatly encouraged him. He sent parties inland to explore the rivers and seek out the source of the precious metal. His reports back to Spain would paint a vivid picture of a land brimming with potential wealth. The sailing conditions along the coast of Hispaniola were not always easy. The waters were dotted with reefs and hidden shoals, requiring constant vigilance. Despite his skills, Columbus was about to face the greatest maritime disaster of his first voyage, an event that would dramatically alter his plans and set a new, fateful course for the men he would leave behind. It was Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1492. The Santa Maria, Columbus's flagship, was sailing along the northern coast of Hispaniola, near the present-day site of Cap Haitian. The seas were calm, the night was still, and the crew, exhausted from weeks of constant vigilance in celebration of the approaching holiday, had grown lax. Columbus himself, after days of sleepless nights, had retired to his cabin, entrusting the helm to a young cabin boy, against standing orders that the rudder should always be steered by a seasoned mariner. The fatal error occurred in the early hours of Christmas Day. Around midnight, while the young boy at the tiller was either asleep or simply inexperienced, the Santa Maria drifted silently off course. Before anyone realized the danger, the ship's keel scraped against a coral reef. The grinding sound of wood on rock jolted the crew awake. Panic immediately ensued. Columbus, roused from his...
The loss of the Santa Maria, though a devastating blow to Columbus and his immediate plans, quickly transformed in his mind into a providential opportunity. The abundance of timber from the wrecked ship, combined with the apparent docility and generosity of the local Taíno, particularly their chief, Guacanagari, presented a compelling case for establishing a temporary settlement. Columbus reasoned that leaving a contingent of men behind would serve several crucial purposes. First, it would solve the immediate logistical problem of overcrowding on the two remaining caravels, the Niña and the Pinta, which, unbeknownst to Columbus, was still somewhere exploring independently. Second, and more importantly, it would establish a Spanish presence in this new land, securing their claim and allowing for continued exploration and the search for gold while Columbus returned to Spain to report his discoveries. It was a strategic move, transforming a disaster into a potential advantage. The chosen site for the new settlement was a sheltered bay near the wreck, in the territory of Guacanagari. Columbus named the new fortress La Navidad, in honor of the day the shipwreck occurred. The construction of La Navidad began immediately, utilizing the salvaged timbers from the Santa Maria along with local wood. The Taíno, under Guacanagari's direction, continued to assist, helping the Spaniards transport materials and offering their labor. They seemed genuinely eager to help, perhaps viewing the Europeans as powerful, benevolent visitors, or simply as people in need.
The destruction of La Navidad cast a long, ominous shadow over the second expedition. Columbus, deeply disturbed by the massacre of his men, understood that a new approach was necessary. The initial dream of peaceful coexistence based on the Taínos' perceived docility had been brutally shattered. Now the emphasis shifted irrevocably towards establishing a secure, defensible European presence, one that would project Spanish power and ensure the exploitation of the island's resources. Leaving the desolate ruins of La Navidad behind, Columbus sailed eastward along the northern coast of Hispaniola, searching for a more suitable site for a permanent settlement. He eventually found a promising location about 30 miles east of the destroyed fort, near a good harbor and close to what he believed were gold-bearing rivers. Here, in January 1494, he founded the city of Isabella, named in honor of the Queen of Castile. Isabella was conceived as the first true European city in the Americas. It was laid out with streets, a plaza, a church, and stone buildings, a stark contrast to the flimsy wooden palisade of La Navidad. The thousands of men who had accompanied Columbus on this voyage immediately set to work, clearing land, constructing buildings, and digging for gold. The conditions at Isabella, however, quickly deteriorated. The site was poorly chosen, plagued by mosquitoes, and lacked a reliable source of fresh water. Disease, particularly malaria, and possibly syphilis, which many historians now believe Europeans contracted from the indigenous population, quickly spread through the crowded, unsanitary settlement. Many of the men, accustomed to military campaigns or the easy life of gentlemen, were ill-suited for the arduous labor of building a new city in a tropical climate. Enthusiasm waned, replaced by sickness, disillusionment, and discontent. Columbus, ever the pragmatic leader, ordered his men to construct a fort, establish farms, and continue the search for gold. He dispatched expeditions into the interior of Hispaniola, particularly to the region of Cibao, which the Taíno had indicated as rich in gold. These expeditions confirmed the presence of gold in the riverbeds, though not in the vast quantities that had been hoped for. The gold was alluvial, meaning it was found in river sands, requiring tedious panning rather than easy mining. The initial promise of a quick fortune began to fade. The men, many of whom had come expecting to simply pick gold off the ground, grew increasingly frustrated. Columbus, under immense pressure to deliver on his promises to the crown, responded with increasing severity. He established a strict regime, forcing the men to work and punishing insubordination harshly. This led to growing resentment among the colonists, many of whom were nobles or gentlemen who resented manual labor and Columbus's authority. Meanwhile, relations with the indigenous Taíno began to fray further. The initial goodwill and curiosity quickly eroded as the Spanish presence became more intrusive and demanding. The Spaniards, suffering from disease and desperate for food, began to raid Taíno villages, seizing provisions and demanding labor. They continued to take Taíno women, sparking outrage and resistance among the native men. The Taíno, under their various caciques, particularly the powerful Cayanabo, who had destroyed La Navidad, began to resist the Spanish encroachment. They refused to cooperate with the gold-seeking expeditions, withheld food, and launched sporadic attacks on Spanish foraging parties. Columbus, seeing this resistance as a challenge to Spanish authority, responded with brutal force. He led military expeditions into the interior, employing the horses, crossbows, and firearms that were terrifyingly new to the Taíno. The Spanish tactics, including the use of war dogs and cavalry, were devastatingly effective against the lightly armed Taino. Cayanabo was captured, and many of his people were killed or enslaved. This marked a turning point. The Spanish, having established their military superiority, began to impose a system of tribute on the Taino. Every adult Taino was required to deliver a certain quantity of gold dust every 3 months. Those who failed to meet the quota were severely punished, often by having their hands cut off. This brutal system, designed to extract wealth, placed an unbearable burden on the Taino, who had no tradition of large-scale gold mining and whose agricultural practices were disrupted. The tribute system quickly led to widespread suffering, starvation, and flight among the Taino. Many fled into the mountains, abandoning their villages and fields, which in turn exacerbated the food shortages for the Spanish colonists. The imposition of European diseases, to which the indigenous population had no immunity, further decimated their numbers. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and other Old World pathogens swept through the Caribbean, killing millions. For Columbus, the challenges were mounting. He was not only struggling with the hostile environment and the rebellious colonists, but also facing a growing chorus of complaints back in Spain. His strict rule, his failure to deliver vast quantities of gold immediately, and the reports of his men's suffering led to a stream of negative letters reaching the Spanish court. Critics accused him of tyranny, mismanagement, and incompetence. The promises of boundless wealth seemed to have evaporated, replaced by reports of disease, violence, and meager gold returns. Columbus, increasingly isolated and under pressure, decided he needed to return to Spain to defend his reputation and secure further royal support. In March 1496, leaving his brother Bartholomew in charge of the struggling colony, Columbus departed Hispaniola on his second return voyage. He brought with him some gold, some indigenous captives, now enslaved, and the bitter experience of a colony teetering on the brink of collapse. The triumphant hero of 1493 was now a beleaguered administrator, facing mounting challenges and a growing realization that the New World was far more complex and resistant to European domination than he had ever imagined. The seeds of empire had been sown, but they were already watered with blood and disillusionment.
The death of Christopher Columbus in 1506 marked the end of an extraordinary personal journey, but for the new world he had so dramatically unveiled, it was merely the beginning of a profound and irreversible transformation. The immediate aftermath of his voyages, particularly the second and third, laid the groundwork for a new era of European expansion and, tragically, for the systematic subjugation and decimation of the indigenous populations of the Americas. With Columbus gone, the Spanish crown moved swiftly to consolidate its control over the newly discovered territories. Nicolau del Vando, the governor sent to replace Columbus in Hispaniola, proved to be a far more ruthless and effective administrator. He arrived in Hispaniola in 1502 with a massive fleet of 2,500 colonists, signaling Spain's serious commitment to establishing a permanent and profitable empire. Ovando's governorship was characterized by a brutal efficiency in the pursuit of gold and the imposition of Spanish authority. He swiftly crushed any remaining Taino resistance, including a massacre of numerous caciques, and intensified the system of forced labor. The repartimiento system, which had begun under Columbus, evolved into the encomienda system, granting Spanish settlers rights to the labor and tribute of specific groups of Taino. In theory, the encomenderos, holders of encomiendas, were supposed to protect and Christianize the indigenous peoples, but in practice, it became a system of brutal exploitation. Under the encomienda,
Taino men were forced to work in the gold mines for months at a time, often in harsh conditions and with inadequate food. Women and children were pressed into agricultural labor or domestic service. The relentless demands, coupled with the continued spread of Old World diseases, created a demographic catastrophe. The Taino population, estimated to be hundreds of thousands, if not millions at the time of Columbus's arrival, dwindled rapidly. Within a few decades, their numbers were reduced to mere thousands, and by the mid-16th century, the Taino culture on Hispaniola was virtually extinguished. The Spanish crown, while asserting its authority, was also concerned with the long-term viability of the colonies. Queen Isabella, before her death, had expressed a desire for the humane treatment of the natives, seeing them as potential converts to Christianity. However, the economic imperative for gold and the realities of colonial power often superseded these humanitarian concerns. The early Spanish colonies were not just about extraction, they were also about establishing a new society, replicating European institutions, and creating a new hierarchy. The search for gold, though yielding less than initially hoped for, remained the primary driver of exploration and exploitation. The gold found in Hispaniola was primarily alluvial, requiring intensive labor to pan from riverbeds. As these readily accessible sources diminished, the Spanish began to look further afield, leading to new expeditions to other islands and eventually to the mainland. The initial success of Columbus, despite his personal failures as an administrator, inspired a wave of subsequent voyages of discovery and conquest. Explorers like Alonso de Ojeda, Vicente Yáñez Pinzón, who had commanded the Niña on the first voyage, Juan de la Cosa, who had owned the Santa Maria, and later figures like Vasco Núñez de Balboa and Hernán Cortés built upon Columbus's foundational discoveries. Balboa, crossing the Isthmus of Panama in 1513, became the first European to sight the Pacific Ocean from the American continent, confirming the existence of a vast unknown body of water that separated the New World from Asia. This discovery finally shattered Columbus's enduring belief that he had reached the Indies. It confirmed that an entirely new continental landmass lay between Europe and Asia, a continent that would come to be known as America. The naming of the Americas itself is a curious footnote to Columbus's legacy. It was not named after Columbus, but after another Italian navigator, Amerigo Vespucci. Vespucci, who participated in several voyages to the New World in the late 1990s and early 1500s, was one of the first to articulate the idea that these lands were not Asia, but a Novus Mundus, a new world. His detailed letters and accounts were widely published in Europe, and in 1507, a German cartographer named Martin Waldseemüller, impressed with Vespucci's insights, produced a world map that for the first time labeled the new continent America.
In honor of Amerigo Vespucci, the name stuck, forever overshadowing Columbus's direct connection to the lands he had discovered. The Columbian Exchange, a term coined by historian Alfred W. Crosby, describes the vast, interconnected network of exchange that began in 1492. It was a two-way street, but its impact was profoundly asymmetrical. From the Old World, Europe, Africa, and Asia, came horses, cattle, pigs, sheep, goats, and chickens, which irrevocably altered the American landscape and indigenous cultures. Wheat, rice, barley, oats, coffee, and sugarcane were introduced, transforming agriculture and diets. But the most devastating imports were diseases: smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, malaria, and yellow fever. These diseases, against which indigenous populations had no immunity, caused unprecedented demographic collapse, wiping out 90% or more of the native inhabitants in many regions within a century of contact. In return, the New World offered a wealth of new foods that would revolutionize European and global diets: potatoes, maize, corn, tomatoes, chilies,
peanuts, beans, squash, avocados, and, significantly, chocolate and tobacco. These crops, high in nutritional value and adaptable to diverse climates, would contribute to massive population growth in Europe and beyond, ironically, fueling the very colonial powers that had brought such devastation to the Americas. Silver and gold from the mines of Mexico and Peru, discovered later in the 16th century, flowed into Europe, fueling its nascent capitalist economies and financing its wars, but also causing massive inflation and economic disruption. The immediate impact of 1492 was also the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. As indigenous populations dwindled due to disease and brutal labor conditions, the Spanish and Portuguese began to import enslaved Africans to work the mines and plantations. This horrific trade would endure for centuries, forcibly transporting millions of Africans across the Atlantic, creating a new brutal dimension to the New World's development. The long-term consequences of Columbus's arrival were nothing short of epical. It marked the definitive shift from a fragmented, regionalized world to an increasingly interconnected global system. The balance of power in Europe shifted, with Spain and Portugal rising as dominant colonial powers, followed by England, France, and the Netherlands. The economic engine of Europe was profoundly reshaped by the influx of American resources and the expansion of global trade networks. The intellectual and scientific understanding of the world was fundamentally challenged. The discovery of two vast unknown continents forced Europeans to redraw their maps, reconsider their geographical theories, and expand their understanding of human diversity. It spurred further scientific inquiry, exploration, and the development of new technologies. However, this era of unprecedented European expansion came at an immense cost to the indigenous peoples of the Americas. Their lands were seized, their culture suppressed or destroyed, their populations decimated by disease and violence, and their sovereignty extinguished. The narrative of discovery from a European perspective often obscured the profound suffering and dispossession experienced by those who had lived on these lands for millennia. Columbus's legacy remains intensely debated. For some, he is a heroic figure, a visionary navigator who dared to venture into the unknown, opening up new frontiers and connecting disparate parts of the world. He is seen as a symbol of human courage, ambition, and the relentless spirit of exploration. His voyages are celebrated as a pivotal moment that ushered in the modern era, leading to globalization and the rise of Western civilization. For others, he is a symbol of conquest, colonization, and the brutal exploitation of indigenous peoples. His arrival marks the beginning of genocide, cultural destruction, and the transatlantic slave trade. He represents the dark side of European expansion, the imposition of foreign religions and systems, and the catastrophic loss of life and sovereignty for the native inhabitants of the Americas. The truth, as often is the case in history, lies somewhere in the complex intersection of these perspectives. Columbus was a man of his time, driven by the ambitions and prejudices of 15th century Europe. He was undeniably a brilliant mariner and a tenacious leader whose voyages irrevocably changed the course of human history. Yet, he also initiated a chain of events that led to unimaginable suffering for millions.
The reverberations of 1492 extended far beyond the immediate shores of Hispaniola, shaping the geopolitical landscape of Europe for centuries to come. Spain, having secured a papal bull and the Treaty of Tordesillas, now held a seemingly undisputed claim to the vast, newly revealed lands to the west. This vast dominion, initially perceived as a direct route to Asia, quickly transformed into an empire in its own right, one built on the extraction of resources and the subjugation of indigenous labor. The influx of wealth,
particularly silver from the later discovered mines of Potosi in present-day Bolivia and Zacatecas in Mexico, dramatically altered Europe's economy. This silver, transported across the Atlantic in heavily guarded convoys, fueled Spain's golden age, allowing it to finance vast armies and wage wars across the continent. However, the sheer volume of precious metals also led to rampant inflation, known as the price revolution, which destabilized economies across Europe, benefiting some classes while impoverishing others. The competition for these new riches and territories intensified among European powers. England, France, and the Netherlands, initially slower to engage in transatlantic exploration due to internal conflicts or focus on other trading routes, soon realized the immense potential of the New World. They began to sponsor their own voyages of discovery, leading to the exploration and eventual colonization of North America, the Caribbean, and parts of South America. This global scramble for colonies would define international relations for centuries, leading to numerous wars and diplomatic conflicts. The very concept of discovery itself became a central theme of European expansion. Maps were constantly redrawn, incorporating new coastlines, rivers, and mountain ranges. Scientific inquiry flourished, driven by the need for better navigation techniques, cartography, and understanding of the new flora, fauna, and peoples encountered. Botany, zoology, and anthropology began to emerge as nascent fields of study, fueled by the wonders of the New World. Yet, beneath this veneer of progress and scientific advancement lay a brutal reality for the indigenous inhabitants. The patterns established in Hispaniola, the imposition of forced labor, the devastating impact of disease, the cultural destruction, and the violent suppression of resistance were replicated across the Americas as European powers expanded their reach. The encomienda system, though eventually reformed, paved the way for other forms of coerced labor, such as the repartimiento and later the hacienda system, which tied indigenous populations to specific lands and forced them into servitude. The New World became a laboratory for colonial governance and economic exploitation. European powers experimented with different models of administration, resource extraction, and social control. The Spanish established a vast bureaucratic empire centered around viceroyalties, audiencias, and a complex legal system. The Portuguese focused on sugar plantations in Brazil, heavily reliant on African slave labor. The English and French in North America often pursued different models of settlement and trade, but their impact on indigenous populations was equally devastating. The religious dimension of European expansion was also profound. Catholic missionaries, primarily Franciscans, Dominicans, and later Jesuits, poured into the Americas, driven by a fervent desire to convert the indigenous populations to Christianity. Churches were built, indigenous religious practices were suppressed, and millions were baptized. While some missionaries genuinely sought to protect indigenous rights and alleviate their suffering, the overall effect was often one of cultural imposition and the erosion of traditional belief systems. The indigenous resistance, though often outmatched by European weaponry and disease, was persistent and varied. From the initial skirmishes in the Caribbean to the later larger-scale rebellions like the Pueblo Rebellion in North America, Native peoples fought fiercely to defend their lands, their cultures, and their way of life. These acts of resistance, though often ultimately unsuccessful against the tide of European expansion, demonstrated the resilience and determination of indigenous communities. The environmental consequences of the Columbian exchange were equally transformative. The introduction of European livestock, particularly cattle and pigs, led to significant ecological changes, including overgrazing and the alteration of native ecosystems. European crops replaced indigenous ones, leading to changes in land use and agricultural practices. Deforestation for timber and agriculture began to alter the landscape, while mining activities polluted rivers and scarred the earth. The long shadow of 1492 continues to influence contemporary societies in the Americas and globally. The demographic composition of the Americas, with its complex mix of indigenous, European, and African peoples, is a direct result of the events set in motion by Columbus's voyages. The economic disparities, social hierarchies, and cultural tensions that persist in many parts of the Americas can often be traced back to the colonial structures and legacies established in the centuries following 1492. The debates surrounding Columbus's legacy, whether he was a hero or a villain, a discoverer or a conqueror, reflect deeper societal discussions about colonialism, historical memory, and the acknowledgement of past injustices. Many indigenous groups and their allies view Columbus Day as a day of mourning and protest, highlighting the devastating impact of his arrival on their ancestors and cultures. Conversely, others defend his historical significance as a brave explorer who opened up new possibilities for humanity. Ultimately, 1492 was not an isolated event, but a catalyst. It was the spark that ignited a chain reaction of global consequences, forever altering the course of human history, connecting continents that had existed in isolation for millennia, and setting in motion the forces that would shape the modern world. The story of Christopher Columbus's arrival in the Americas is not just a tale of adventure and discovery, but a complex narrative of ambition, conquest, cultural collision, and the enduring legacy of a single, fateful journey across the ocean sea. It is a story that continues to unfold, its meaning reinterpreted and re-examined with each passing generation, as we grapple with the profound and often contradictory inheritance of that pivotal year.
New World, though he still believed it was connected to Asia, possibly the earthly paradise described in biblical texts. The discovery of the South American mainland was, in a geographical sense, his most significant achievement after the initial landfall. He had not found a direct passage to the east, but he had opened up an entirely new continent to European exploration. However, the pearls he found in the Gulf of Paria would be among the few highlights of this increasingly troubled voyage. His health was deteriorating, his eyes were failing, and he was suffering from gout and possibly arthritis. More critically, the situation in Hispaniola had spiraled into chaos during his prolonged absence. When Columbus finally arrived back in Hispaniola on August 31st, 1498, he found the colony of Isabella in utter disarray. His brother Bartholomew, left in charge, had struggled to maintain control. The Spanish colonists were deeply discontented, suffering from disease, starvation, and a lack of quick riches. A major rebellion, led by Francisco Roldan, a prominent colonist and former Chief Justice, had erupted. Roldan's rebellion was fueled by resentment against the Columbus brothers' authoritarian rule, their perceived mismanagement, and the failure to find immediate wealth. Roldan and his followers had abandoned Isabella, established their own base, and lived off the land, often exploiting and abusing the Taíno population, who were caught between the warring Spanish factions. Columbus, physically and mentally exhausted, found himself in an impossible situation. He tried to negotiate with Roldan, offering concessions and pardons, but the rebellion had fractured the colony beyond easy repair. The indigenous population, already suffering terribly from disease, forced labor, and violence, was further decimated by the internecine conflicts among the Spanish. The system of repartimiento, a precursor to the encomienda system, began to take root during this period.
Instead of a centralized tribute system, individual Spanish colonists were granted control over groups of Taíno, forcing them to work for them in exchange for protection and religious instruction, which rarely materialized. This institutionalized forced labor further accelerated the decline of the Taíno population. News of the chaos and civil strife in Hispaniola, coupled with the persistent complaints against Columbus's leadership, continued to reach the Spanish court. The monarchs, now with a clearer understanding of the difficulties in the New World and growing increasingly impatient with the lack of stable governance and consistent returns, decided to send a royal commissioner to investigate. In 1500, Francisco de Bobadilla, a knight of the Order of Calatrava, arrived in Hispaniola with sweeping powers. His mission was to restore order, investigate the complaints against Columbus, and, if necessary, take over the governance of the colony. Bobadilla quickly concluded that Columbus and his brothers were responsible for the chaos. Without a formal trial and acting with extreme prejudice, Bobadilla ordered the arrest of Christopher Columbus and his brothers, Bartholomew and Diego. In a shocking turn of events, the admiral of the ocean sea, the discoverer of a new world, was clapped in irons and sent back to Spain as a prisoner. It was a humiliating end to his time as governor, a stark reversal of fortune for the man who had brought so much glory to the Spanish crown. Columbus arrived in Cadiz in chains in October 1500. The sight of the renowned navigator in such a degraded state caused a public outcry. The monarchs, though they had authorized Bobadilla's investigation, were reportedly dismayed by the severity of his actions. They immediately ordered Columbus's release and summoned him to court. At court, Columbus passionately defended himself, presenting his version of events and accusing Bobadilla of overstepping his authority. The monarchs, while restoring his personal liberty and titles, did not restore him to his position as governor. They acknowledged his extraordinary achievements as an explorer, but clearly had lost faith in his administrative abilities. Nicolas de Ovando was appointed as the new governor of Hispaniola, dispatched with a massive fleet and thousands of colonists to establish a more stable and centralized colonial administration. Despite his fall from grace as a governor, Columbus still harbored the dream of finding a westward passage to the east, a strait that would lead him directly to the Spice Islands of Asia. He lobbied tirelessly for one final voyage, appealing to the monarch's desire for a direct trade route that would bypass Portuguese dominance. In 1502, remarkably, he was granted permission for a fourth and final expedition, albeit with strict instructions not to return to Hispaniola, where Ovando was now in charge. This fourth voyage, known as the High Voyage, would prove to be Columbus's most arduous and perhaps most frustrating. It was a testament to his enduring obsession, a final, desperate attempt to fulfill the original promise of his grand design. The narrative of 1492 is often simplified, reduced to a moment of singular discovery. Yet its true complexity lies in the ripple effect it had across continents, cultures, and centuries. The profound impact on the indigenous peoples of the Americas cannot be overstated. Before 1492, the Americas were home to diverse civilizations, rich cultures, and sophisticated societies, many of which had flourished for thousands of years. From the agricultural innovations of the Maya and Aztec to the vast networks of the Inca Empire, the continent was a vibrant tapestry of human achievement. Columbus's arrival, followed by waves of European explorers, conquistadors, and settlers, initiated a period of unprecedented trauma for these societies. The most immediate and devastating impact was demographic. The Great Dying, as it is often termed, saw indigenous populations plummet by an estimated 90% or more in many regions. This was primarily due to the introduction of Old World diseases, against which native populations had no inherited immunity. Entire communities, villages, and even vast empires were decimated by smallpox, measles, influenza, and other pathogens that swept like wildfire across the continents. Beyond disease, violence, and warfare, often driven by European greed for gold and land, also contributed significantly to the loss of life. The imposition of European political, economic, and religious systems further dismantled indigenous societies. Traditional land ownership was replaced by European concepts of private property, often leading to forced displacement and the concentration of land in European hands. Indigenous governance structures were dismantled, replaced by colonial administrations designed to serve the interests of the European metropolises. The forced conversion to Christianity, often accompanied by the destruction of sacred sites and religious artifacts, aimed to erase traditional spiritual beliefs and practices. The economic exploitation was relentless. The search for gold and silver, initially through tribute and forced labor in the Caribbean, escalated to industrial-scale mining in Mexico and Peru. This wealth, while enriching European powers, came at an immense human cost, with millions of indigenous people dying in the mines. The rise of plantation economies, particularly for sugar, tobacco, and cotton, further fueled the demand for coerced labor, leading directly to the expansion of the transatlantic slave trade. African peoples, forcibly uprooted from their homelands, were brought to the Americas to replace the dwindling native labor force, creating new layers of ethnic and social complexity and perpetuating a brutal system of human bondage that would last for centuries. The Columbian Exchange, as a broader phenomenon, also reshaped global ecosystems. The deliberate introduction of European animals like horses, cattle, and pigs, while providing new food sources and modes of transportation, also had profound environmental consequences, including overgrazing, soil erosion, and the displacement of native species. Conversely, American crops like potatoes, maize, and tomatoes fundamentally transformed diets and agricultural practices in Europe, Asia, and Africa, leading to significant population growth and diversification of food sources. The intellectual and philosophical impact of the New World on Europe was equally transformative. The existence of vast, previously unknown lands challenged deeply held European beliefs about geography, history, and theology. It sparked intense debates about the nature of humanity, the concept of savagery versus civilization, and the rights of indigenous peoples. Figures like Bartolomé de las Casas, a Spanish Dominican friar who had witnessed the brutality of the encomienda system firsthand, became vocal advocates for indigenous rights, sparking important moral and legal discussions within Spain and beyond, though often with limited practical effect. The New World also became a canvas for European utopian ideals and dystopian realities. It was seen as a land of opportunity, a place where new societies could be built, free from the old world's constraints. For some, it was a chance for religious freedom. For others, a path to social mobility. And for many, simply a place to escape poverty or persecution. But for the indigenous peoples, it became a land of invasion, subjugation, and cultural annihilation. The legacy of 1492 is not confined to the past. It continues to shape the present.
the political boundaries of nation-states in the Americas, the distribution of wealth, the patterns of racial and ethnic identity, and ongoing struggles for land rights and self-determination for indigenous peoples are all deeply rooted in the colonial history initiated by Columbus's voyages. The very names of places, the languages spoken, and the dominant religions are testaments to the profound and lasting impact of Europeanization. The contemporary debates surrounding Columbus Day, the removal of statues, and the re-evaluation of historical narratives reflect a continuing struggle to come to terms with this complex past. Indigenous peoples and their allies advocate for Indigenous Peoples Day, seeking to center the narrative on the experiences and resilience of Native communities, to acknowledge the immense suffering, and to celebrate the enduring presence of indigenous cultures. Columbus's voyage was a singular act of daring, an unprecedented feat of navigation that undeniably connected two previously separate parts of the globe. But that connection was not benign. It was the spark that ignited the age of discovery, which for many became the age of catastrophe. Understanding 1492 requires acknowledging both the extraordinary human achievement and the immense human cost, recognizing that history is rarely simple and its legacies are always contested. The journey that began on August 3, 1492 from Palos continues to resonate, shaping the contours of our shared global heritage.
The transformation initiated by Christopher Columbus's voyage was not merely geographical or demographic. It was also a profound shift in the global economy and the balance of power. Before 1492, the economic centers of the world were largely in Asia, with China and India at the heart of vast trading networks. The Silk Road and maritime routes across the Indian Ocean brought immense wealth and exotic goods to Europe. European powers were eager to find direct access to these riches, hence the competitive race for routes to the east. Columbus's accidental discovery of the Americas, while not initially providing the Asian spices he sought, opened up entirely new sources of wealth: land, labor, and eventually, vast quantities of precious metals. The gold and silver extracted from the Americas, particularly from the mines of Zacatecas and Potosi, provided an unprecedented infusion of capital into the European economy. This influx of bullion, estimated to be hundreds of thousands of tons of silver and thousands of tons of gold over the colonial period, fundamentally altered global trade patterns. Spain became the wealthiest nation in Europe, at least for a time, financing its imperial ambitions and wars. However, this wealth was also a double-edged sword. The massive increase in the money supply, without a corresponding increase in goods and services, led to rampant inflation across Europe, diminishing the purchasing power of wages and creating economic hardship for many, particularly the lower classes. This economic upheaval contributed to social unrest and the eventual decline of Spain's economic dominance, as other nations like England and the Netherlands developed more diversified economies based on trade, manufacturing, and later industrialization. The Atlantic Ocean, once a terrifying barrier, became the central highway of global commerce. New trade routes emerged, connecting Europe, Africa, and the Americas in what became known as the triangular trade. Manufactured goods from Europe flowed to Africa, where they were exchanged for enslaved people. These enslaved Africans were then forcibly transported across the brutal Middle Passage to the Americas, where their labor was exploited on plantations to produce raw materials like sugar, tobacco, and cotton. These raw materials were then shipped back to Europe, completing the triangle and fueling European industries and consumer markets. This system, built on the suffering of millions, generated immense profits for European merchants and fueled the growth of powerful port cities like Liverpool, Bristol, and Nantes. The Age of Exploration, sparked by Columbus, also led to the rise of powerful, centralized nation-states in Europe. Monarchs, increasingly wealthy from colonial ventures, gained more power, funding larger armies and navies to protect their overseas interests and compete with rival empires. This era saw the consolidation of imperial powers and the establishment of vast colonial empires that would shape global politics for centuries. The exchange of knowledge was another profound impact. European cartographers had to entirely redraw their world maps, incorporating two vast continents previously unknown to them. This forced a reevaluation of classical geographical text and a new emphasis on empirical observation. Naturalists and scientists eagerly studied the new species of plants and animals found in the Americas, expanding the European understanding of the natural world. The sheer diversity of life encountered challenged existing biological classifications and spurred the development of new scientific methodologies. However, this exchange was often one-sided. While Europe gained immense knowledge and resources from the Americas, much indigenous knowledge was lost or suppressed by European colonizers who viewed it as primitive. The imposition of European languages and educational systems further marginalized indigenous forms of knowledge and cultural expression. The cultural impact of 1492 was also a complex tapestry of assimilation, resistance, and hybridity. European languages, religions, and social customs were imposed, but they were also adapted and transformed by indigenous and African influences, leading to the emergence of unique Creole cultures and syncretic religious practices. The blending of cuisines, music, and artistic forms created entirely new cultural expressions that are distinctively American. The enduring legacy of 1492 is thus multi-layered. It is the story of human ambition and technological prowess, of pushing boundaries and expanding horizons. But it is also the story of conquest, exploitation, and immense suffering. It laid the foundation for global capitalism, created the first truly interconnected world, and led to the rise of Western dominance. At the same time, it initiated processes of colonization, slavery, and environmental degradation whose consequences are still felt today. The complexities of this legacy demand a nuanced understanding. Columbus himself was a product of his time, driven by a mix of religious fervor, personal ambition, and an adherence to the prevailing and often flawed scientific understanding of his era. His actions and the actions of those who followed set in motion forces of globalization that were both constructive and destructive. The world of 2024 is, in many ways, a direct descendant of the world shaped by the events of 1492. From the global distribution of crops like maize and potatoes, to the enduring patterns of wealth and inequality, to the ongoing debates about historical memory and indigenous rights, the echoes of Columbus's arrival continue to resonate. The challenge for us, as inheritors of this complex history, is to understand its full scope, to acknowledge its diverse impacts, and to learn from its lessons, both triumphs and tragedies, as we navigate the interconnected world that began to emerge on that fateful day in October, over 5 centuries ago.
The enduring story of 1492 is one that continues to be written, reinterpreted, and debated with each passing generation. It is a testament to the profound and multifaceted impact of Christopher Columbus's first voyage, an event that, more than any other, marked the definitive end of one era and the dramatic beginning of another. The implications of that fateful journey, initially conceived as a shortcut to the East, reverberated across continents, shaping economies, redrawing maps, and forever altering the course of human societies. From the grand ambitions of Columbus, driven by a blend of piety, geographical miscalculation, and a relentless desire for glory and wealth, to the tense negotiations with the Spanish monarchs, the story is one of audacious vision against formidable odds. The perilous Atlantic crossing, filled with the fears of the unknown and the threat of mutiny, highlights the sheer courage and tenacity required for such an undertaking.
The eventual landfall on San Salvador, a moment of profound relief and triumph for the weary European sailors, was simultaneously the dawn of an irreversible transformation for the indigenous Taino people. The initial encounters, marked by curiosity and the exchange of trinkets for gold, quickly gave way to a darker reality. Columbus, while often expressing admiration for the Taínos' gentleness and beauty, viewed them through the lens of European superiority, seeing them as potential converts, laborers, and subjects for the Spanish crown. The relentless search for gold, the imposition of European authority, and the devastating impact of Old World diseases rapidly decimated the native populations, leading to immense suffering and the destruction of ancient cultures. The establishment of the first European settlements, from the ill-fated La Navidad to the struggling city of Isamena, marked the beginning of sustained colonization. These early ventures were fraught with challenges: disease, internal strife among the colonists, and growing resistance from the indigenous inhabitants. Columbus's struggles as an administrator, his eventual fall from grace, and his return to Spain in chains underscored the immense difficulties of governing a new world and the complex interplay of ambition, power, and human nature. Yet, despite his personal setbacks, Columbus's voyages unleashed forces that could not be contained. The revelation of two vast, previously unknown continents fundamentally reshaped European understanding of the world. It ignited an era of unprecedented global exploration, conquest, and colonization as other European powers joined the race for overseas empires. The flow of silver and gold from the Americas transformed global economies, fueling European expansion and contributing to the rise of capitalism, while also creating inflation and new forms of economic dependency. The Columbian Exchange, the vast interchange of plants, animals, diseases, and cultures between the Old and New Worlds, created a truly interconnected global ecosystem. While American crops like maize and potatoes revolutionized diets worldwide, European diseases tragically decimated indigenous populations, leading to the horrific transatlantic slave trade as millions of Africans were forcibly brought to the Americas to fuel colonial economies. The legacy of 1492, therefore, remains deeply contested. For many, Columbus is a heroic figure, a symbol of daring exploration and the human spirit of discovery, whose voyages ushered in a new era of global interconnectedness. His name is synonymous with the bravery required to venture into the unknown and fundamentally change the course of history. For others, particularly indigenous peoples and their allies, Columbus represents the beginning of centuries of oppression, cultural destruction, and genocide. His arrival marked the violent imposition of European power, the theft of land, the enslavement of peoples, and the devastating loss of life and sovereignty. From this perspective, 1492 is not a moment of celebration, but a somber reminder of profound historical injustices. In contemporary society, these different perspectives continue to clash, fueling debates over historical monuments, national holidays, and the interpretation of history. Understanding 1492 requires acknowledging both the monumental achievement of transoceanic travel and the catastrophic consequences that followed for the indigenous inhabitants of the Americas. It demands a nuanced approach that grapples with the complexities of historical figures and events, recognizing that progress for one group often came at the severe expense of another. The story of Christopher Columbus arriving in the Americas is not just a chapter in a history book. It is a foundational narrative that continues to shape the world we live in. Its echoes resonate in our geopolitical structures, our economic systems, our demographic makeup, and our ongoing conversations about identity, justice, and reconciliation. It is a story that reminds us of the profound power of human ambition, the fragility of cultures, and the irreversible nature of historical change. As we look back at that pivotal year, we are reminded that the past is never truly past, and its lessons continue to inform our present and guide our future.
The narrative of Christopher Columbus's arrival in the Americas, though often framed as a singular event, is in fact a complex tapestry woven from threads of individual ambition, geopolitical rivalry, technological innovation, and profound cultural collision. The year 1492 stands as a watershed moment, a pivot point in human history that fundamentally reoriented global interactions and set in motion forces whose momentum continues to shape our world today. Columbus himself was a figure of contradictions, a brilliant and tenacious mariner, driven by an almost messianic conviction. He possessed the navigational skill and sheer willpower to achieve what many of his contemporaries deemed impossible. His meticulous record-keeping, his keen observations of natural phenomena, and his unwavering leadership in the face of mutiny and despair underscore his extraordinary capabilities as an explorer. Yet he was also a man of his era, imbued with the ethnocentric biases, religious zealotry, and economic imperatives that characterized late 15th century Europe. His vision of the New World was inextricably linked to the pursuit of gold, the acquisition of territory, and the conversion of souls, often at immense human cost. The immediate aftermath of his voyages, particularly the second and third expeditions, rapidly transformed the initial act of discovery into an act of conquest and colonization. The brutal realities of the encomienda system, the decimation of indigenous populations by disease and violence, and the desperate search for wealth laid the foundation for the vast Spanish Empire in the Americas. This was not a gradual assimilation, but a rapid and often violent imposition of European systems, leading to the destruction of ancient civilizations and the profound suffering of millions. The Columbian Exchange, a term that encapsulates the vast transatlantic transfer of plants, animals, diseases, and cultures, irrevocably altered global ecosystems and human societies. While new crops from the Americas revolutionized European diets and fueled population growth, Old World diseases wreaked havoc on indigenous communities, leading to demographic collapses that are almost unparalleled in human history. This depopulation, in turn, created the labor vacuum that fueled the transatlantic slave trade, establishing a brutal economic system that would endure for centuries and leave a lasting legacy of racial inequality. Beyond the immediate human and environmental impacts, 1492 instigated a fundamental shift in global power dynamics. Spain, and later Portugal, Britain, France, and the Netherlands leveraged their colonial empires to amass unprecedented wealth and influence, leading to a period of European dominance that would last for centuries. The Atlantic, once a barrier, became the central artery of a burgeoning global economy connecting continents in a vast network of trade, exploitation, and cultural exchange. The intellectual and scientific consequences were equally profound. The discovery of two entirely new continents forced European scholars to abandon long-held geographical assumptions and embrace empirical observation. This spurred advancements in cartography, navigation, and the natural sciences, expanding the boundaries of human knowledge and laying some of the groundwork for the scientific revolution. However, the narrative of progress and discovery remains deeply contested. For many indigenous peoples across the Americas, 1492 marks not a beginning, but a rupture, the start of a long and painful history of dispossession, cultural suppression, and systemic injustice. Their voices, once silenced or marginalized in dominant historical narratives, are now increasingly central to understanding the true complexities of this pivotal period. The ongoing debates surrounding Columbus Day, the removal of colonial statues, and the push for Indigenous Peoples Day reflect a societal reckoning with this difficult past and a demand for a more inclusive and accurate historical memory.
The story of Christopher Columbus in 1492 is thus a microcosm of the broader human experience, a tale of daring ambition and unintended consequences, of profound transformation and immense suffering. It teaches us about the interconnectedness of seemingly disparate events, the long shadow of historical decisions, and the enduring power of human agency, both for creation and destruction. As we navigate the challenges and opportunities of our own interconnected world, understanding the multifaceted legacy of 1492 remains crucial. It reminds us that history is not static, but a living, evolving narrative constantly reinterpreted and re-examined as we strive to build a more just and equitable future upon the foundations of a complex and often painful past. This story, though centuries old, continues to resonate, its lessons vital for understanding who we are and how we came to be.